The prognosis is we're still, the doctor hasn't looked at him.
What's that? Yeah. Yeah,
But
I think the judge.
the nurse seems to feel that his pneumonia has cleared up.
It's not
So
that complicated.
apparently that's a lot of.
No.
And I haven't read all the
less stress on the body.
Because the briefing contains everything. You don't, the judge doesn't have to take witnesses or think of stuff. It's just like, this is the law. But given the way the judge has gone so far.
All right, you ready, Scott?
Judge, I think. Oh, no, that's right.
This is the one that's different.
Ready? All right, I'd like to call this work session to order. We will be changing the agenda slightly. We're going to hold off on the Clackamas City's dinner discussion until the regular session. And we'll start with the Milwaukie Bay Park update. And that will be presented by Kelly Brooks and probably people from us.
I just want to introduce the speakers and then I'll step back. So Kelly Brooks, Assistant City Manager, and tonight NCPRD, Heather is here from NCPRD, and we have Melinda from 2 Week Studios. And what they're going to do is walk through the outputs from, they just did a major design workshop with the community on the 15th where they were looking at 3 different alternatives. Now from the 15th to the end of the year, they're refining that down into one preferred alternative. So with that, I'll actually just have them come up and talk to you about what they heard from the community and the various outreach and walk through that this evening.
Great, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Mayor and councilors. I'm always happy to be here to provide some updates, and the project seems to be moving rather quickly. So I'm back again already, and I know you feel like you probably just saw me, but I'm here again.
I promise lots of work has happened in between.
Yeah. So we just have a few things to kind of loop back to tonight to give you an idea of what we've been up to this fall. A lot of you know because you've been at events, and so some of this will be recap for some of you, but just to give everyone good visibility of what's going on, what we've been doing this fall, and what we are in the midst of at the moment. We were here last on September 18th, this exact duo. And we just talked about our summer progress at this point. So we seem to be aligned with the seasons. We're here tonight to talk about the fall update. And particularly that pertains to the design alternatives that we developed this fall, to talk specifically about some highlights from public engagement, because that has been aligned with our sort of design milestones. Also to talk about this process of how we move from alternatives and tons of qualitative input to a final design. Glad she's here for that. Also to talk really for the first time about what it looks like to look at cost estimates at this phase. I know that won't be a new thing for most of you. You've seen a lot of projects, but we did want to start kind of talking about funding tonight in a slightly more real way than we have in the past. And we'll just go back again over the schedule. It looks the same. Things are kind of moving as we planned. And then just recap with some next steps and leave some time for discussion. Fall progress, we started right around the time we were here last time, really sifting through a lot of feedback from our August event and taking that into a design direction for the alternatives. And also just continuing to plan the engagement events, which is, quite a lot of work in its own right. So by October, we had worked with the SAC and continuously the Steering Advisory Committee and with the Project Management Group to really hone in on some draft alternatives. We revised those, refined them, and got ourselves ready for a public workshop and the launch of an online survey. So that happened in early to mid-November. Our survey just technically closed on Friday, although I noticed it was still up, so there might have been a few people sneaking in under the wire. And really what we're doing now is we're pivoting from this big pulse of design and pulse of input to this development of the final design. You can think of it like a preferred alternative. The outreach, the engagement, as you know from these kind of projects, it really never stops. Especially if you keep asking. So we continue to ask, not only because we have different phases of work, but because we have a lot of different potential audiences in the city and in the district that we want to make sure we're being engaged with. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So Melinda, Jonathan, and Tom, the magical trio from Tuing Studio worked really hard throughout the fall to develop these design alternatives. We unveiled them to the public, first to the SAC, our steering advisory committee, and then to the public on November 15th. So there were 3 alternatives, and I don't plan to talk a lot about these, but I'll pass the comment sheet around that we used at the event, which just has a kind of summary in the centerfold, so you can take a look at those if you want to reference them once the slide is passed. So we had flow, that was a real kind of more organic form that really spoke to the topography and the meandering of the river. There was a second alternative, fluvial, that spoke to, again, sort of a water flow related geometry, but a fairly different layout, still the same basic core elements, but looking at it in a slightly different way in terms of the relationship of the elements and the circulation. And then Vista, which was, again, a different way of looking at the program elements on site, different relationships, different organization, different circulation, a little bit more of a concept of direct connection from various points in the park. And what these were meant to do was really juxtapose different approaches and different ideas so that we could tease out input and not really so much pick 1, 2, or 3, but let us know what works, what doesn't work from your perspective, so we can hone in on what pieces and parts we can take and refashion. And I don't want to steal Melinda's thunder, so I'll leave it at that. I will take a little bit of time to just give you a summary of the public engagement work, because this has been a really important part of the project. We spent some time, particularly in October, doing outreach to let people know about where we were and the event that we were having. So between the farmers market, sending out postcards, putting up flyers, doing social media, we really felt we were able to get the word out, and we always work with city staff on this as well, so that's a tremendous help, just even with putting stuff up and printing out posters and doing stuff on social media. We then had the November 15th open house itself and the survey that was open for just over 2 weeks. Well, stick with it for a moment with open house. We had a format that was half open house and half small group discussion. So it was a little bit of a marathon night for some of our wonderful volunteers, but we were actually surprised at how long attendees were there and stayed. So there was a really, not only were there quite a few people, there was a really deep level of engagement that was just really fun and encouraging to see. The online survey, again, went up the same day. It was open for just over 2 weeks. And then we had a little bit of a lag with our Spanish survey, but that finally went up last week after Thanksgiving. And that's open a little later to give respondents a chance to actually respond. So that's staying open through December 17th, if you in particular know of Spanish-speaking individuals who would appreciate access to that survey.
I was going to say, how are you promoting that since it went up late? Are you getting the word out to any of the Spanish organizations? Or?
Yes, that's a good question. We definitely have some channels through social media, and I've been working with district-wide contacts through the North Clackamas School District and the Hispanic Interagency Networking Task Force to try to get a little bit better word out. I actually had the pleasure of attending a Milwaukie high school. They have a group called the Padres Latinos Mustangs, and they came out last week, and we had a really robust discussion about the alternatives. So I think word's getting out. It's probably still a fairly small percentage of getting word out, but I think we're actually reaching some people, which is promising. Thank you for asking. And then ongoing, trying to continue to have some small group meetings like that, because even now that we're getting past 3 alternatives, there's still a lot of fine grain of design that is to come. And people can still provide meaningful input, not after this phase. So we've had some meetings with people who either are experiencing disabilities or who work with communities experiencing disabilities. We've been trying to have more robust conversations with people in Native American tribal government, with people of color, Spanish speakers. So we're trying to reach those groups. It's a little bit slower than the rest of the kind of big outreach, but I think we're making some good inroads into the community that way and trying to get a little bit of a broader reach. And then I just want to give a shout out to the SAC volunteers, because we have this core group of 12 people who've been really engaged in this project. And not only do they show up at meetings and do they look at stuff that we send them, but they show up to do things like help at the farmers market, to help at big events. Several people will have, side conversations with me about ideas that they have to reach a certain community. And then there's individuals who've actually, helped go to meetings with me to meet with small groups. So this steering advisory committee has been just outstanding and has really helped boost this project's capabilities quite a bit. November 15th, just some quick highlights of the numbers. We had what we think from the sign-ins, we had about 75 people that attended. Those that stayed for the table discussions included about 40 people, not including the staff and the SAC members. We ended up having about 50 comment forms returned, which had a lot of good feedback on them. And then overall on the online survey, we have, they have tallied about 364 survey respondents, including 264 indication of a preference for alternatives. So even though we weren't really asking people to vote, we did say, which one do you prefer? Is there, and they could choose more than one, so this could have been 264 people, or it could have been a little less. But what it indicated to us is that people did have more of a preference for alternatives 1, flow, and alternatives 2 in the survey, but we did see some difference with how people responded, both in person at the discussions and on the comment form. So it sort of depended on the format, but alternatives 1 and 2 were the ones that kind of bubbled to the top a bit. Yes.
Sorry for interrupting. What did you mean by you saw a difference between the online survey versus those who attended in person?
Good question. I think we saw more of a, well, first of all, I should just say the actual information we're providing is pretty qualitative, especially compared to the last survey. So we're still sifting through that and trying to analyze, do more of a qualitative analysis on the data itself. But the survey tended to get, for example, more responses on the first alternative in general, and then it tended to kind of drop off. And we don't have, statistical confidence that it dropped off because of less interest, or if it dropped off because...
So you didn't have it set up so that depending on who you were, you saw a different alternative.
Right.
Correct. It wasn't randomized.
But hindsight being 2020, that would have been good. And so there was that, and online, the experience is quite different. You can learn a ton online. There's the whole presentation from November 15th was uploaded, but it's a very visual experience versus when you went to this workshop live, you got background information, you got to talk with staff and volunteers, you maybe got to sit down for an hour's worth of discussion. So the comments became a lot more nuanced. And I think that's where we saw, like, I'm gonna not say too much because, again, Melinda will have some good information to add on this, but that's the kind of the nature of the difference that we saw.
Thank you.
So we're making some educated guesses about why, but there were some differences. And then I think at this point, I'd love Melinda to talk a little bit about some of the highlights that came out for the qualitative input.
Yeah, and actually, let's go ahead and build off of your question, Shane, because I think it's really interesting. We see this a lot. When you do a drawing for someone and they're looking at it in what would be plan view, two-dimensional, it's really difficult for the layperson, and frankly, I'm really bad at it, which, like, I took a test and should have known early on this wasn't my profession. I have trouble mentally rotating and popping things into 3D, which are really key skills for my profession, but we'll work past that. So when the public looks at those 3 diagrams, they're largely looking at them in plan view. It's really difficult for them to understand where things live topographically. So on a site like yours, when we start talking to people and we're like, okay, this is really near this in elevation versus just as if everything was flat, we started to see in particular scheme 2, some of those relationships of things to 99E that were separated started to come out a little bit more. Whereas, when people look at it online, they picture everything as flat, and so that doesn't rise to the surface. But this is where things do get a little tricky for us, because, we intentionally develop 3 schemes to test things. So in those 3 schemes, for instance, you'll see the big open space, the amphitheater, and 2 of them lived at the nose of the site. In the 3rd scheme, it lived back, kind of more to the north. We tested things like with a water feature. In one scheme, it's near Monroe, level with 99E. It's pulled back for safety reasons, but you could see it from downtown really easily. In the next scheme, it's dropped down the hillside a bit. In the 3rd scheme, it's kind of tucked over to the side so you discover it. So the schemes were carefully crafted to not allow people to pick a favorite in some ways, and to really kind of try and think through their decision-making process. What the program's elements were, where they lived on the site, how they related to each other. I do think in the online survey, people kind of gravitating to that kind of sweeping form. We tend to see a lot of that in park design in general, but particularly on this site where it's next to the river, people are, I think, responding to that kind of organic character. So when we go through this list of things, we try and hold in our brains both the functional pieces, where things live on the site and how they're related to each other, but then also the character that people might be responding to, so that we can also take that forward. So in general, as Heather mentioned, 1 and 2 were favored. There were a couple elements in 3. The straight shot connection from top to bottom of bank, people resonated with them. And also that scheme has a bit more of a contiguous natural space. All the schemes had that to some degree, but that one in particular was easy for people to be like, that's what that program element is. That's a chunk of nature. We really clearly heard, again, what you heard the first time around when you worked the plan in 2010, playground and restroom. It's really important to have them adjacent to each other. We also heard that the play area and the water feature, as much as people liked the civic nature of a plaza at Monroe, there was concern about any adjacency of kids immediately next to 99E on that same topo line. So that was a strong preference, to drop those things down. So bear in mind, the piece that nobody told us in the interview was where the flood line was, right? So that line's pretty high up the bank. So that puts us in that kind of, I don't know if you remember from early on the site analysis, there's a band in the middle, almost like a belt across the site, that keeps your capital investment out of the floodplain, but now also keeps your kids off of 99E. This idea of connections on this site, it is a sloped site, but everybody, folks with disabilities, but folks with kids, wide range of ages of people that are interested in the park. So connectivity, accessibility, really huge. So that's going to be important. We did get a lot of, things not necessarily related to one plan or another. Protect views, understand what are important views. People want shade. I mean, it's, that's kind of a product right now of the open nature of the site. So everybody's asking for shade. Incorporating natural areas, again, that's kind of what resonated in number 3, because people had brought that forward early on, but that was the scheme that they could really see it in. So trying to make sure that that element comes into the final plan. Providing flexible space, really robust dialogue about just the amphitheater, right? You're like, it's an open lawn space, people. How much can you talk about it? But if you put stairs, if you put a lot of stairs in it, it's fantastic because there's seating opportunities, there's flat space to lay out blankets. But if you take all the stairs out, it's a wonderful opportunity, right, for flexible play, for throwing a frisbee. So,
And for geese.
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Should have populated it. Change the road, probably.
I think they'll be there. I think the amphitheater was a good example, right, of you're just trying to find the balance. You're trying to find, how do we let people sit? How do we introduce some flexibility? But everybody knows they want an open space. That's the amphitheater. There was also, a desire to have that amphitheater kind of moved down, not the scheme that puts it up north, but bring it down into the nose of the site. That, I think that's that relationship to the river that people are really responding to. And then this one we got tagged on, which we knew in our heads already, but as designers, sometimes you try and dodge the hard questions. Monroe, it's the Civic Plaza, it's the straight shot from downtown, but everything's telling us, the Max line, the farmer's market, the food court, the high school, there's going to be this flow down Washington. It lands you in a tough spot. You're right kind of at the driveway. It's a pinch point with a slope. But, that's the great thing about public is they don't care. They're about the reality. I'm going to come down Washington and I want to feel like I've arrived. So what are you going to do about that? So that floated to the surface. You want to pop to the next one and we'll talk. So the day after, you get all this public feedback and you realize that you were rewarded for all of your hard work with exactly what you wanted, which was robust dialogue and no clear answer. And so this is the way that design moves it forward.
Is that what you really wanted?
Yeah. Well, you go into, you're like, don't pick. And then I do think sometime in the middle of the night, you're like, oh God, just pick a scheme. Like, right, we'll build that. But as designers, this is the fun part of the design process. You do wake up the next morning, you sift through it, and you see things like, okay, easy, low-hanging fruit. Amphitheater wants to be in the nose of the site. Water needs to come down the slope. But then you do start saying, how do you do that, but also get a little bit more of this connectivity, this flowing river circulation across the site. And you just lay down trace paper and you keep drawing and recalculating grades and moving the parts and pieces around because now you have a more refined goal as set by the public. I do want to note, like on this diagram, where you see public input, that's how you start resolving public input. It is always responsible, though, back to the technical information. It is cost prohibitive to move all of the electrical underground on that site. It's outside the scope of the project to redo the parking area. It is impossible to move the floodplain. So there are still these pieces. Regulatory, we have a permit. It comes with requirements for cut and fill, balancing the amount of soil we move. Comes with requirements for how much impervious paved we put on the site. So all of those things also have to be met. So what we do is we lay down the trace, we move ourselves towards this new collective vision, and then we call our civil engineer, who's, I think, actually out of the country, but still working on the project. He's on vacation, and I just don't think he's telling his family. So, he's calcing cut and fill on the new scheme as we develop it. And then that's how we kind of move the process towards a final design that works.
So when you say, you mentioned the parking lot's out of the scope of the project, and I guess I also had thought the trolley trail was out of the scope of the project, but I noticed your alignments do mess with the trolley trail, do move it around or show it being reconfigured.
Yeah, so we're guided, or we're directed to integrate the trolley trail. We are testing some different alignments. We're trying to stay really cognizant of, you can't mess with the curb line. There was some initial thinking of like, could we steal the bike lane from ODOT? And then, stealing from ODOT is just a really challenging thing. So, we all stepped away from that. But we are looking at if there is benefit to be gained by tweaking that alignment. That is something we're looking at.
And we had laid out in our requests for proposals that trolley trail was non-negotiable as far as the trolley trail must continue to exist, but that the alignment that was put there was, temporary until there was a permanent park design.
Okay.
That being said, if the current alignment worked perfectly for the big picture, then nothing would need to be moved. But realistically, there's probably some tweak to the alignment that will make more sense with something in that space besides the redwood tree.
Things we're looking at, like considerations for that, would be how do you balance commuter cycle traffic with bringing more people into the park? What's the interface with the plazas or the pedestrian trails? Also, just the relationship to the road. Is there a way that you can retain kind of that efficiency of non-vehicular movement, but also provide an opportunity for the pedestrian experience to be a little more enhanced? So yeah, that's where the tweaking's coming from.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about, we're going to get to costs, I guess, but it seemed to me that was a place where, maybe if we,
Savings.
yeah, we could find some savings if we're worried about costs, so.
Yeah,
Well,
and
we've got to do some, it's funky the way it is now anyway, so we've got to do some things with it one way or the other.
So what do you mean by funky? Help me out with that.
Well, you, as a cyclist, when you're going south on it, you're coming down along and then there's this hard right, hard left, back. These curves are great. They're nice flowing curves. But that's this crazy hard right that I've seen at an intersection. Right, so you've got places where people could go two different directions. And so if you've got cyclists going both ways, you're trying to figure out what are you doing, and it's not ideal right now, the way it is.
I can't picture where the hard right is. I mean, I've ridden it. Where's there a hard right?
So-
Unless you're trying to go down into the sewage treatment
No,
plant
you're not.
property.
You're staying along, so think about you going south,
No,
right?
no.
Just past the,
Washington Street.
the art piece.
the trolley,
Oh, uh-huh.
the metal
Uh-huh.
trolley.
You have to go hard right and then hard left. It's literally, I mean, I'm usually doing it at 20 miles an hour, and it's like a hard bank and a hard bank. It's,
I never thought it was hard, but okay.
I'm not
I've
saying
never
hard
gone
is
fast enough
difficult.
to
I'm
bank
saying it's
anywhere, so that may be
extreme.
part
I
of
was going to say, at the speed I'm going, it's not, yeah. it might
You
be
and
a
I probably
speed
just
thing.
aren't banking.
But ultimately,
Yeah.
oh, sorry.
And we've got two weird trails, right? I don't think we need what we've got there, so we want to,
Well, there is some duplicity, yeah, I would agree with that. But.
in any case.
Always the challenge with the bike and ped stuff is typically, unless you're in like a utopian area like greenfield development, which, might have its own issues in some people's minds, you're usually dealing with ped infrastructure overlaid or inserted into an environment that maybe just once upon a time had a road and a skinny sidewalk or no sidewalk at all. So oftentimes this challenge exists of trying to get bike and ped facilities into an area where it gets clunky. And so I think the great thing is we have a trolley trail now, and to look at ways we might be able to improve it. Maybe there's some low-cost ways we can do it with the alignment. Maybe there's some ways that make it function so much more safely that it would, the cost would be justifiable. But, ultimately making those systems as intuitive as possible also makes them safer and avoids part conflicts. And it hasn't been at a technical level to get a lot of specific bike ped input, but I am actually meeting with the Clackamas County Bike and Ped group tonight to see if they want to take a closer look and make any, give any feedback, make any suggestions. So we'll have a lot of eyes on this to see what can work.
I apologize, I'm going to break out. It's 4:30. We've got a housing forum on Thursday that I'm going to go step out for just 30 minutes. But thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I really appreciate the update, and I'll look forward to seeing the rest of it later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I should also move on. So it's really fun to think about the design. It is a really good reality check to start thinking about costs. And the good news is we're starting to get to a point where we can actually start estimating, but it's still very ballpark. The kind of difficult part is once you start getting numbers, it can get sobering pretty quickly, right? So the gray box here is what you've seen before. We talked about $3 million in the Milwaukie CIP. We talked about $3.8 million in the RFP just for construction costs, the hard costs. When we're looking at these alternatives now, despite the range of alternatives, we're seeing the numbers come in for construction costs at $7.9 million, which is a pretty big gap, as you can see. So there's a lot of, we're looking at these numbers and starting to have discussions like what's real and what's not. How much, in doing alternatives, how much duplication is there? Like how efficient is the design? how big are the contingencies right now, and at what point can we start making those more realistic? Well, we can start making those more realistic when the design becomes more advanced. And so right now we're sort of grappling with, like, is this, or how real is this number? How much will this change when we get into final design? And what things will we need to actively do to make it a more efficient, cost-effective design? And do you want to speak to that briefly? I know you guys have some other agenda items as well.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. I think from the design perspective, what we do as designers is we try and remember what the core program elements are, what the initial charge is, how the community has prioritized things to date. The designs do currently have, so for instance, if the community says, oh, we'd like flexible space, picnic area, one of the schemes has a more formalized picnic area with a proposed cover. That sort of stuff becomes the low-hanging fruit, the core program elements of play, interactive water feature. Those core pieces become more protected. So simplifying as we go into the final refinement. And then also simplifying within the program elements. Interactive water feature can be everything right from, well, not the Bellagio because they don't let you get in, but it can be huge, it can be Salmon Springs, but it can also be something much more modest. So as we kind of move forward in tandem with the funding solutions, that's just in our brains as designers. And last but not least is we try not to create a design that hangs everything on one kind of like golden goose. Like, this is the thing that has to, be the grandest, otherwise the whole design falls apart. So, yeah, it's kind of going back to your roots and getting a little bit more, small town, farm. That's just my background. And so it's like, okay, well, what do you need to make the place work? And then what layers can you afford to put on top of it to make it sing?
Well, and I'll just add too, you've seen this slide before, but this was the list of program elements kind of more strictly coming into the project. And, we always hear that expression, something is greater than the sum of its parts. But in a way, we could end up looking at something that's less than the sum of its parts. Sometimes by the time you add all this stuff in, it's like cha-ching, cha-ching, it just keeps adding up. But when you have good design and you have good guidance from the community on priorities, then you can start taking that design and sort of finding the simplicity or the elegance in it. That's my hope. That being said, that's not always easy, and it's not always, magical. But, we did start with a really robust list of program elements, so we've really held on to those. And then at some point, if we need to revisit where things are and how they are, then, then I think we'd need to revisit that at that point. It's still pretty early, but we do need to start looking at the numbers. And before I talk just briefly about funding, there's our next, Melinda's going to correct me if I'm wrong, our next timing for revised cost estimates would be with the final design that will go through some internal review at the city and the county before we make some revisions and work with the public on it. And at that point, I would say probably mid to late January is when we'll be expecting a revised cost estimate. So the preferred alternative or the final design will be advanced enough that we can get another round of estimate and start looking at, all right, does this seem like it's meeting our needs? Does it seem like it's overboard? Does it seem like it's not sufficient? And kind of it gets more real.
So when you start thinking about things that you may have to pull out or scale back, are there things in there that could be, scaled back but added back in at the future if money allows without a new permitting process? So like if you don't cover a picnic area, but that's not a hardscaping thing, so could you still add a covered picnic area?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes and no. And that's one of the things that when you do the construction document set, so now you've really got your design dialed in and your funding strategy. what you can do is do additive alternates. This is things like we draw the walls in the amphitheater as stone to match the stone that you have at the kayak launch area. If the budget isn't there and you can't do it, those fall back to being concrete, that sort of thing, like a material swap. The one caveat is that adding back after you've cleared a contractor from the site is much more problematic. It's kind of like picture doing work at your house. You pay the refrigerator guy just to ring your doorbell. He's done nothing. Construction on a big site is like that. They call it mobilizing, which is a fancy word for you're going to pay for me to ring your doorbell. So it's really going to be, you're going to want to figure out an alignment of your budget and construction to the greatest degree possible before you mobilize them. So, yeah, there can be things that you can add on if the costs come in really good from a public bid. But it's not impossible, but I would just put the caveat on, don't get too excited about coming back to the park and phasing more things in because it just gets more expensive. I think it's cheaper.
And we will be really trying to think of everything in the beginning, you know, how to integrate art so that it can be integrated into the costs more versus like plopped on later. But, you know, I think ultimately it doesn't really matter how much it costs if we don't have funding. And so, you know, just as important is the process of figuring out, you know, how do we want to go after funding? How hard do we want to try? You know, what partners make sense for this project? Who cares about this project? I think there's probably a lot of people that care about this project, not just locally, but partners see this as a really, I mean, it's a very special site, and it's, it just has a lot going for it. And so, you know, this list is still not, you know, like, you know, promised funds except for what the city has allocated. But, you know, we have SDZ Zone 1 funds that will be accessible. You know, I can't tell you what the allocations will be, but that will be an ongoing conversation, of course. There's competitive grants and partners out there who would probably be able to take a look at this with us and say, yeah, this makes sense for us. So some of that is really gearing up as a staff and as elected officials and partners to figure out how we want to make it happen and how much is important for us. You know, like if you have something you really care about, you're willing to ask for it. And if you're like, well, that part's not that important, I don't want to knock on somebody's door about that thing. You know, so the rubber will meet the road there, I think. So we're working on this simultaneously as we're working on design and costs because the two obviously go together.
So when you arrived at that, what was it, 7.9? Mm-hmm. Were there items or portions of this that were like a big chunk? Like was there a $3 million, was the water play area at $3 million? I mean, are there parts that are really significant?
Yeah, that's actually a really, also a really good question. It's not that simple at this stage because like your biggest costs at this stage on this site, a lot of it has to do with earthwork, utilities, actually preparing the site for construction, moving the soil around, that sort of thing. I can tell you, you know, like on the cost estimate, it doesn't break out like, oh, if they eliminated the water feature, if they eliminated the playground, they'd be there. But those are going to be your more expensive pieces just by their nature. It's probably easier to say that you're going to put an area square footage into naturalized planting than it is to say the same square foot cost for a water feature, because you don't have the mechanical. So interactive water feature, anything built, interactive water feature, play, even in its most rudimentary, you know, like nature play. God, it just seems like it should be cheap, right? Like we all grew up with like tires off of tractors and, you know, logs. Nowadays, though, that log has to be over safety surfacing of some sort. It has to be structurally engineered and ADA compliant and, you know.
Bolted to the ground.
Yeah, nothing is cheap. So.
Can't we have the area where people sign waivers and they just walk in?
Well, that's called Australia.
Says the attorney.
Like you get off the plane and you sign the form.
Build him a forest.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you volunteering?
I'll draft the waiver, but if that'll save on cost, I don't know. I'm happy to do that.
It is a good question, though, and it's something that we'll keep looking for, like, as we go along. If we came to you and we said, you know what the trolley trail really wants? It wants to be granite pavers. Then you should, one, fire us, and then two, that would be an example of just like a big number, a big ask. So, yeah, this isn't a park that has, it's not super complicated. It just all adds up. There isn't like lighted sports fields that you can move somewhere else and save yourself a bunch of budget. It's that you're on a slope, you have to move a bunch of soil, and it's not good soil that's out there. You have picked a handful of solid program elements: play area, water feature, amphitheater, stage. And yeah, it's just ludicrously expensive to build public work.
So on the funding, I mean, I understand why you're not trying to attach numbers to anything, but I guess I'm glad that you included other and private. I think that's something that we as a city have not been very good at. We haven't been very successful on the library in that regard, but I mean, historically, we haven't been very successful. But I personally think we should probably. So there was an effort in 2012. You were on the council. Does that sound right? There was an effort in 2012 where a contractor was hired to raise money for the prior phase. And I was in some meetings with that contractor and the then community development director and this mayor and the prior mayor. And the guy said, well, he'd met with a bunch of people and he'd done all this, meetings with all the big industries and Bob's Red Mill and everybody. And, nobody wanted to put money in because Milwaukie didn't have skin in the game. And so then, because, I think, we were looking maybe to the private funders to fund everything, I guess. So then the city got grants and did the Kellogg Good Neighbor thing that got Phase 2 built, and unfortunately didn't go back out at that juncture and say, okay, folks, you said if we had skin in the game, we've got it, come on. But now if we're talking about a project where we think we have, say, $3 million from our sources,
and we've already invested $3 million.
And we've already invested $3 million. I mean, we obviously have skin in the game. We're having a different conversation than we were having in 2012. And I guess I wonder if it's not a good idea to hire somebody who really knows about that kind of corporate fundraising to do some of that.
I think one thing I would say to that, Lisa, is I would just really encourage both NCPRD, but also the city of Milwaukie, to recognize what you've got here. I think, like when you're raised in a small town, you sometimes fail to accurately value your own assets, your own resources. I grew up in a huge floodplain of wetlands, and frankly, it was a pain in the butt when it flooded, and that's all I knew. But now, in hindsight, it's something that's really valued in the world. So, for the city of Milwaukie to go to a private donor, like this is a special, one of the last places on the Willamette that can really become an example of balancing stewardship, small town heritage, regional recreation. So I feel like there's a really strong narrative there. It's just trying to get it in front of somebody that will write you a check.
Right. And I mean, that's not something that any of us, I guess, have particular skill with. But there are people who do have that skill set. And maybe we should be thinking about contracting.
Yeah.
Heather, when you were doing the outreach and the online surveys, did we keep track of where those respondents were coming from within the district or even regionally?
I think their code is, as long as people provide demographic information, I think they're coded by zip code.
Okay.
I think that's the finest grain that we ask for, and it's optional. So I have not seen that data yet from the survey. I know the number of respondents, but I don't know the fine grain yet. But we can find that out for you.
It would be by zip code?
Yeah.
And so I'll go back to what we've talked about before. This says Zone 1 funds, but this is really a regional amenity. And we had talked at one point about district-wide funds. And I'm hoping that that's still on the table since As I understand it, the Board of County Commissioners could, by legislative act, change these zones or get rid of them next month if they wanted. It's an artificial boundary, so it's an artificial dollar. But it's a regional amenity.
And didn't you find that they used district-wide on Hoodview or something? They used, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think,
And I don't know how the Happy Valley litigation plays into the funding right now, but
Utterly.
confoundingly.
anyway, I just like to make sure that we keep that conversation open, that I
Absolutely.
don't necessarily see a restriction to Zone 1 SDCs, not for a regional park.
And it is designated by NCPRD as a regional, as well as, by everybody else that talks about it.
And I definitely will bring that back to our full staff as well. I know that there's been conversation, there's kind of the Milwaukie proceeds, and then there's the UGMA proceeds, and there's district-wide proceeds. There's things that still are sorting out about proceeds from the sale of Hoodview Sports Complex. So, there's a lot at play here. I definitely don't have a crystal ball for it, but I know that, the district is very much willing to keep having the conversations about, what's applicable and what's going to be needed for the project. So we definitely need to stay in conversation, and I'll make sure that Catherine and Scott also, have heard that concern as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm concerned that we're running into other agenda items, so just.
You are. You're actually 15 minutes over, just so you know.
We're 15 minutes over, so I'm in big trouble with Ann in particular. Timeline, we're kind of on the same timeline. This is a slide you've seen before, so we're continuing to stay on that. And next steps, obviously, final design. We're going to be getting more into the nitty-gritty of permitting and approvals and what's needed there. We're going to be doing more internal review with the city and county. NCPRD in January before we bring that preferred alternative, the final design, to the public, continuing on outreach, continuing on funding, more cost estimates, as I mentioned, and then hoping to stay on target for a late February public meeting where we can bring an alternative that has been well vetted with the district and Milwaukie to the public. So that's everything I had.
So I have a quick question about how people learned certain things. For example, you said there's a strong interest in the amphitheater being sort of at that nose, which is also the lowest elevation portion of the park. So by design, you're putting a stage, which will have electronics, in the place most likely to flood in the park. Was that made clear to people when they were...
Yeah, no, that's actually, you have a very smart constituency, and everybody asked exactly that. Well, what about, there is a strong desire to have it prepared for events to some degree. So what we have told them is anything, them being the public and the stakeholders, the SAC meeting, anything that we put in that floodplain to some degree will become collateral damage. So, for instance, electronics, the major panels and whatnot can be located outside of the floodplain. Those would be up high, likely in the restroom, out of the floodplain. But anything like outlets that are left down at the stage level, those would be vulnerable. So yeah, that is a piece. I think people's sense is that they can't get everything they want into the band that's out of the floodplain, but below 90/90 and off the slope, just by its sheer footprint. The alternate 3, yeah, even the flood line creeps up to where the stage would be.
It does. It's
better.
still a couple 3 feet higher than
It's
where
better.
it's going to be at the nose.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I didn't want to, since we are so late, I have all kinds of, I think, views about the various options, but I would just say, this kind of gets to one of my points, which is that, to me, the stage should not be oriented to the west. It should not be at the lowest point. It should be oriented to the northwest or the southwest, but you stare straight into the sun if it's oriented
So
to the
Lisa,
west.
you'll be happy to know that one of your community members thoroughly shamed us by bringing that up on a microphone at the public meeting. And we were like, that is so smart. So this current scheme we're looking at, it does have the open space there, but it is rotating ever so slightly the stage towards Elk Rock.
Yeah.
So those are the nuances. And this is truly why you take it to the public, not just for like the big things, but because there's always somebody in the room that's smarter than you. So, yeah.
Or has been down there for
Right,
events and the sun
Yeah.
stared into the sun. Yeah. So I mean, that might help bring the stage a little higher up out of the, the lowest depths of the,
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? So, all right, yeah. Leave it. I also.
Well, yeah, if we had more time, we would.
Yeah, we probably
know that
needed
we
a
have-
longer
Need another
agenda
scheduling.
item for this. Another.
There's a lot to chew on.
We are planning to be back. I think we have a placeholder on February 5th. But, if you have concerns about talking again, just talk with Ann. And
How deeply into the design will you be by then?
It's moving quickly. We will present, what am I on? Are we like a week and a half out from like at least a draft where things will live, how they'll be oriented? So yeah, it's moving really quickly. We won't have everything dialed in. And that's the other part that's really tricky to help people understand is the big pieces are locking in. It doesn't mean that there's not still room for a lot of questions and manipulating of details, but yeah, the bigger pieces are locking in quickly.
And in terms of planning, the January is when we really will have that draft developed. So, if you didn't want to wait till February and it works for the council to do something else, I'm definitely open to it. So I will just wait and hear from you guys about what you need, and happy to make myself available.
Your December 18th meeting is very, very, very booked. We had a discussion about doing the creation of the Blue Ribbon Committee. If you guys want to punt that to January, since there was some discussion about punting that to January, we could. That buys you an hour. Or we could do this in January. But that's kind of where we're at. We're pretty tight on time right now.
January wouldn't be a bad time, because that really is when we were thinking we would take this draft that's not a full, like, public workshop type of draft, and really talk with the governing bodies, with both the city and the district. And we don't have to wait till the February 5th meeting to do that. So I would really leave that up to you guys. If for some reason you want to do December 18th, I won't be here, but certainly, 2 weeks probably able to have someone here, and, Catherine or Scott, I'm sure could make arrangements without promising. But we will try our best to make anything work if you want to talk more.
Okay.
Or should we just talk one-on-one with you? I mean, the downside of that is we won't hear what the other
Right.
counselors think, but,
I mean, this may be completely inappropriate and weird, but, I mean, from a design perspective, I think a lot of it is just trying to be part of that dialogue, and you guys probably have a lot of questions that other people have had. I mean, if it's something like I come out and we have lunch or a cup of coffee and I just fill you in on the comments, I mean, kind of like to your point, Lisa, of the stage being into the sun, that was something that's talked about. So if it's a matter of just trying to get this group up to speed and feeling comfortable with the conversations that have gone on, I mean, we could do anything. I mean, we're not far away.
but we can only do that in groups of 2, right? Or we run afoul of the public meeting law.
I just get
so.
more coffee. So, yeah. I mean, I guess I would just voice second Heather's thing, is like whatever you guys need to be able to understand the process to date and kind of guide it forward, we're open.
Yeah, we're here, and we're totally willing to talk more.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll figure it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you,
Thank
Melinda.
you.
So
So,
can we, sorry, I want to make sure that figuring it out is figured out for me, because I don't want to be left trying to schedule things. Can we, I mean, I'm happy to help them connect with you guys and to do 2x2s and give you a chance to chat. It does mean you lose each other's comments and that. we can bring them back in December. Your January meeting is actually just as busy as your December 18th meeting. Like, we're starting, unless you want to do it at your January 2nd, because there wouldn't be a decision. That might be a good.
Our
item.
January 9th, our study session
That
is
one's
very big. Is
Yeah, because
full.
that's the boards and commissions discussions that you guys
So
have
the only
taken
thing
it
we're
for.
doing on the 2nd is swearing in.
It is. So if you guys want to add this there, we could totally add it there.
Are you guys out of town on the
I
2nd?
think
Oh,
I
no.
am. What time would it be in the evening?
Yeah, probably around 6:30.
I might be able to get back. Yeah.
Okay. We'll try and put it on to that. We've been trying to keep that from having a decision-making moment simply because we'll have a new council member. I don't want to make her do that. But this would be a great discussion topic. Okay.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right, Kellogg Good Neighbor Committee, Peter Passarelli.
Thank you, Peter. And Charles Bird, it looks like.
And Charles. Anybody else?
Hi, Charles.
Hey, Charles.
Good to see you tonight, sir. Thank you.
Hey, Charles.
Thank you. Hey, Charles, it's nice to see you.
Hi there, Justin Garrett.
Justin, nice to meet you.
Oh.
Charles, nice to meet you.
Good evening, Mayor Gamba and councilors. Tonight, we're going to spend a little bit of time and talk about our Kellogg Good Neighbor Committee, provide you an annual update. This year, we don't have any proposed amendments to the bylaws, but Charles Bird, our chair for the Kellogg Good Neighbor Committee, would like to spend a little bit of time and talk about the accomplishments over the last year and what we're looking forward to working on next year. Charles?
Thanks. First of all, I want to thank you, the councilors, for your tireless efforts and in the work that you do through the years. And I'm honored to be part of this city and part of the committee. I cherish this role. As many of you may know, that I've been here for a few years and I've been a critic of this plant and been involved.
He said you're not talking into the mic. Yeah, you need to pull it closer to you, maybe. Yeah.
All right, how do you know that?
The guy came and signaled us.
So,
Get magic signals.
okay. I thought maybe you had little things in your ears.
No.
And I've been in the neighborhood for a long time, and I've seen this plant badly behave to basically pollute the air that we breathe and the water of the Willamette River, the waters of the state, with seemingly with impunity. And this continued up until the county and the city got together in 2013 and made an agreement that put together. Part of the agreement was to form our committee and to put money on the table. The county set aside money on the table, and two batches of money. One was for odor seed money, and the other was ongoing EDUs, which are about $11,000 a month that comes in, and it goes up and down depending upon the population and the way the uses are calculated. Those are the funds that we have available to make recommendations to this body to propose projects for you, and then you propose them to the county. We have focused on the goals that are in the document, the primary goal being impact from the wastewater treatment plant. And we have almost unanimously fortified that goal, with the first goal being odors, being smells from the plant being number one, and to focus on that. We have set aside, we have spent money, we have authorized money to focus on odor and some other things. But I want to say, before we go into some of this detail, that we are keeping our powder dry. We have money that we can allocate at the moment, something like, and roughly $150,000 that we could allocate for something. But we're trying to keep our powder dry because we want to make sure what's happening is really focused on the smell, and that the neighbors are satisfied or find out, if not, what's next with that one subject. We had, I think you have a copy of, I know you have a copy of this. The completed tasks, since we've been going since 2013, we went on two fronts. The first front was as listed here, and that's what was called the odor study. We came into a group of data that already had odor studies, and we sorted through those, and we found that the odor studies were lacking in terms of their focus on actual odor and more focused on other things such as capital projects and capital expenditures and promotion thereof. We, as a committee, we were critical of the data that we got back, and the city of Milwaukie stepped up and helped put together a consultant who then was not the county's consultant, but a consultant that we brought on in together. And that consultant found that there was a place, an area of the plant that produced most of the smell. And as a term that I like to use is the odor flux. So it's not the stinkiest place, because the previous odor studies had found the stinkiest place, but that really didn't produce anything to speak of. But what we found, what this study found, was where is most of the smell coming from that goes away from the plant. Not the stinkiest necessarily at the source, but and we found that. We found it was there's an aeration bed that's just like a long kind of Olympic swimming pool, and the stinkiest stuff goes in at one end and it gets bubbled with air through the other end. The plant had a cover over the stinkiest part, but right next to that, the next stinkiest part didn't have a cover. And that's where 80% of the smell was coming from that was wafting in the neighborhoods. The study showed that, verified that, showed us some scientific studies and maps with colors on them. We found then that we asked the county to focus on that, to use all of our seed money that remained at that point to just take care of that. They put it in their great work plan, which is to take care of a lot of the deferred maintenance that had been deferred through this period I described, the kind of the dark ages where it was polluting, to fix the plant. So it's been integrated then in that. I'm here to say that the covers are installed, bolted down. The stinkiest air from that is being pulled out by the fans, going through the biofilters. So that's happening. That's happened. That's happening right now. Is it working? That's what the committee's kind of wondering too. So this committee is standing by, continuing to monitor, and we will watch that and we'll observe it, and I would say probably authorize another scientific study if there seems to be some.
Do we have the signs with the phone numbers still up?
Yes, the phone numbers haven't changed. I think there's some signs around there. We keep, every once in a while we talk about maybe some permanent signs.
I think there's one fixed sign I've noticed
the
recently, but there could be more signage.
There's some temporary signs there too.
It'd be good to have.
Yeah, they had the lawn sign type signs a couple years ago, but they haven't had those for a while.
They disappear, degrade, they perish, but that fixed sign is important. So
That fixed sign, the fixed metal sign's a newer installment that I think happened this year that Wes put in, along with some other improvements just recently on some signage
Do you guys,
related to.
do they provide you the info on the number of calls they get or anything?
they do.
They do.
And they go over them with us if we request that.
So have you seen a drop-off in calls since June when they completed this?
I don't have statistical information on that in terms of whether there's a drop-off. I know they get calls when there's events.
Okay.
And there was a couple of events recently since the half year, where they had blowers fail and it stunk up the entire city.
Yeah.
Actually, literally, I smelled it up here, up near the high school.
Yeah, we got warning. They at least advised us on that one.
And then they also were cleaning out their digesters in November too.
Right.
Most recently, or currently ongoing, they're cleaning out those big round tanks that build up with solids in the bottom. They're cleaning those out. And they've been doing it, attempting to do it when the winds are favorable or non-existent. But I know that we had some concern in the neighborhood that they knew they were doing it, and they smelled it, and they said it was really stinky. So it was known and known. So I'm personally really excited about whether this is going to work, to quantify it as an engineer. I want to quantify it like we did before, and then be able to explain back to ourselves and the community and the neighbors if this is it, and what the next step might be, if there's another level of control that can be put in place. So the interesting thing about that, I mentioned I committed all of the odor seed money to do that. Well, when they actually put it together, they found it cost less. So the actual cure for that particular odor event was way less than we had in the, it was $1 million start, and we spent some money for the study, and so we've got credited back. Basically, it's not real money, but it's credited back, so we have more odor seed money to work with, or still have some left, odor seed money.
When did they finish installing that cover?
In June of this year,
It was June.
late June.
The thing that's not on here as far as completed tasks, and I want to say it's completed, it's a planted screen because we spent quite a bit of money. We planted a lot of plants. That was 2 years ago. The plants some have survived past, the time has passed from the point of the warranty is up. Some of the plants are still struggling, and then I want to talk about maintenance later on. But we knew when we put the planted screen proposal together as a committee that plants require attention ongoing, and there were certain elements of that continued on into the full 25 years of our committee. The next thing is, I think that we covered that project, the odor control project funding. Item number 1, item number 2, enhanced public facilities. So we recognize this as a way to create a way to mitigate the impacts of the plant by making it more fun, better, more pleasant place to be, more comfortable. We've done that through lighting, through improving the walkway. People are walking through there, adding some picnic benches and some trash cans. We have recently, the neighbors have mentioned to us that there are some darker places, some dark places, and we went for a walk in our last meeting on the 28th, and we found those dark places and darker places, and have the county is going to make a proposal next time we meet to put some additional lighting to fix the darker places. So that is ongoing. These are relatively low-cost items, but seem to have a pretty high impact in terms of happiness and the way the park looks. I was fortunate, my wife and I, we had one on one of those dinner cruises that we drove by the park a couple of nights ago, and it looks really nice, in my opinion. So I don't know if you share it or not, but it looks really nice. We have some other items that are on here on our work plan where we're paying attention to, and I would listen to your comments back to say, that's way off target, or okay, stay, keep your ears on. It's the Milwaukie Bay Park and Kronberg Park. Parts of those parks are within our 200-yard impact. We're looking for ways that perhaps we can be helpful there in terms of what we do, or perhaps in terms of the resource that we have. If it fits into, it doesn't take away from our prime directive of odor control and mitigation of the plant itself. And item 4 basically is the ongoing to keep watch. We are monitoring now those funds. I think if we don't, no one will, because they're basically on a ledger, and it goes from person to person. We change roles here, so just to keep track of what monies we've allocated, what monies we've spent, and what are left. Working with the City of Milwaukie, City of Milwaukie gets the EDU report, and I use that, and the committee uses that and reports back to the money that we've allocated. So we don't overcommit the funds, and so far it's been working fine. The last item, number 5, is, I think it's one of the more important items. It's basically maintenance. We're titled Maintenance and Replacement of Plantings in the area around the Kellogg treatment plant. I look at that as ongoing, and it will go on even past the committee life of 25 years. Plants need care. We put the plants in place. Wes had stepped up to take care of maintenance on those plants. We found, and Wes found admittedly, that they were not equipped for that in the structure that they'd put forward to do that, because it was a little more complicated than mowing and trimming and letting it go. We needed to have some person or some entity in there with a brain that understood plants, and none of us on the committee are that person. So we had entertained it involving the Parks Department and the county, and Wes had decided that, brought forward the county. They have a group of people that in our maintenance staff that are very, very well equipped to deal with this so far. The committee's decided to continue to listen to them. They're going to come back with a proposal. Within that proposal, there'll be some costs, and within that proposal and the costs, we'll come back to this group to ask for okie dokie on it to see if we can go forward. Breaking it down into what does it mean, there's some plants that are doing well, some plants that are not doing so well. We're thinking of talking about the plants and some plants that have died, replacing the dead ones, maybe moving some plants.
Can you give me percentages on the doing well, not doing well?
Oh, just from the gut. I think we're talking about maybe 10 to 15% that are struggling and have died in that category. most are thriving and doing what they're supposed to do.
Most of them are doing well.
And there's some ongoing development of the philosophy of the planting, and there's some plants there that are not desirable, and some plants that we planted that are desirable. And it was a matter of staging. So we plant the desirable plants, and then you trim away and remove the undesirable plants over time. And that's not going to happen instantly. But the focus of the projects that will come to this committee, the next project, the focus will be to deal with the plants that have died, the plants that are maybe in the wrong place or struggling because they're in the wrong place, the salvage plant material that can be moved and relocated to take advantage of that salvage value of that plant, relocated, and then to propose new plants and new plantings in those areas where it's sparse, basically, with the object of, one, to make the plant disappear behind green. That's one way to mitigate it. The second one is that green then creates a filter, as you were, to slow down the air, to allow the odor system to work inside the plant, and to mix any smelly components with fresh air, and so when they come out, they're diluted in a better way. That's the complete story, and to make it look good from the park standpoint, too. To me, I think that's we spend quite a bit of time on item 5 because it's got a lot of detail in it. Most of the other items we haven't spent too much time on, most recently because the county's doing the install.
So you're waiting on some sort of proposal from the county on that?
Next meeting.
Next meeting.
So we had a meeting. We had a walk around the plant with individuals from our committee, and we walked around and we made some notes. They made some notes. We had another meeting. They had a rough conceptual proposal. The committee liked that. That's at our last regular meeting. And then our next regular meeting, which will be in January 20-something, whatever it is, on a Tuesday, they're going to come back with a proposal that we can talk about. And it's most likely to be a phasing proposal, not something that we're going to say a 25-year plan, but here's what we're going to do. It's going to take a couple of years to do this, and then we'll reevaluate. Questions?
Well, just that we'll have to, our representative to the KGNC is leaving us, so in January we'll have to have a discussion about who's your new council.
Yes, we're excited about that, anxiously waiting.
They're excited to get to me. That's what I
Wait.
We just were starting to get Shane broken in, actually, in the committee.
And Council
They were
President
excited to
Beatty,
get rid of me, too.
we do
so
have
it's
that on
just-
the agenda
I think it's
for
a council thing.
January 15th, for all of them.
All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the ongoing work.
Charles.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we have Kellogg Dam removal conversation. Nothing imminent. Presented by Kelly Brooks and Neil from North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council.
Tessie, I'm going to have you go right here, but we just got to get a presentation pulled up.
It's just the forward arrow, right?
I'll switch you.
That button?
Okay. We're here to talk about Kellogg Dam, which is not a 25-minute long topic.
No.
But we're going
Hey,
to...
it's coming out next week.
Yeah,
We're good.
Yeah, that's why I'm here. Surprise! So we are going to do our best to just run through the main topics that we wanted to cover with you all tonight. The first, and my task, is to just touch on agency coordination, where we've been, where we're going. Tessie Prentice is here to talk through the capstone projects that have been done. There's actually been 3 separate capstone projects. I believe, if I recall, Tessie came to the city as part of the first capstone. Were you working on the capstone?
I was working on the capstone and then got selected as an intern.
So one of the best benefits we got out of that first capstone project was Tessie Prentice.
We got a
This is
good
also
engineer.
Tessie's first time presenting to council, so.
So be gentle.
Yeah, so be nice. And then I'm excited that Neil Schulman, the new executive director of NICUIC, is here to talk to us tonight just about all the great work that he's doing around this project and some of the coordination efforts that he's got underway. So first, let's just talk about agencies. The primary forum in which this discussion is being had at an interagency level is through the Governor's Regional Solution Team. I would categorize that as somewhat dormant over the past year due to the capstone work still being underway, so it needs to be kicked back off. I have, however, talked to the Metro Regional Solutions staff member about that exact thing about a month ago. She knows we're talking about this tonight, and I'm sharing the recap of the capstone findings, and I think probably makes sense for us to get back together with DEQ, ODF&W, and ODOT at that table to talk next steps. And the reason why that's a good thing to do, as Neil will mention in his remarks, there's a few different potential regional funding opportunities on the horizon that I think it would make sense to strategize around a little bit. So there's a regional parks measure that could potentially be a source of funds for this type of a project. And there's also a regional transportation measure in 2020. Again, there is a transportation component to this. And then as we've discussed in the past, while I don't believe that the work is there yet, or the readiness is there to put it in the STIP for the 28 STIP. I'm losing track of my STIPs. The next one out from there, I think, given if we can move some of these items along, potentially could be a way to fund some of the transportation elements related to the project, if that's the direction we're still going in. I have mentioned that to ODOT and have gotten, some nods, but I don't have any commitments there. So definitely no commitments around any of that, but in terms of a timeline, that's sort of been what I've been working with, at least on the state side. So with that, what I'd love to have on our side most of the time go to is actually have Tessie talk to you about what did these capstone projects do and what did we sort out. I will give one asterisk, which is ODF&W did participate. I would say they're enthusiastic about the idea of pursuing an alternative to dam removal, at least in our smart conversations. So I just want to let you know that when you hear these findings related to the capstone work, they're options that are out there, but they're ones that we would need to really robustly discuss with our interagency partners if we're going to move in those directions and get their feedback. So
You're saying ODF&W is enthusiastic about the idea? Not. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Not enthusiastic. Okay. Concerned, I would say. Yeah. So I just want to, before we start going into them, let you know that colors kind of some of what you're hearing. So with that, I think I will hand it over to Tessie, if that's okay, since we're short on time.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we had 3 different groups working on the project over the last 2 years. And the first group was just tasked with what could we do. And they had come up with, basically, actually, they were taking all the data and trying to compile it and figure out what had been done so far and taking that as a first step to then figure out, and where do we go from here? They had done which was called a HEC-RAS model, and it was just a hydraulic analysis of the river and had created some different tools to evaluate. Then the second group, the Alpha Design Group, picked up where they left off of working on the hydraulic model and coming up with, at this point, they were tasked with, could you put in a diversion channel? And if so, what would that look like? And so they used the hydraulic analysis model to figure out, with the HEC-RAS model, what would happen if, and where, trying to figure out where would you put this diversion channel based on where the current dams are located, or bridges rather, are located, and how would that work with the under the road, how could it be constructed? And so they had spent their 2 terms on the capstone project working on what that could be. And then the third group actually was looking at some of it was more of an environmental focus of that there's some contaminated soils there. As soon as you open or remove the dam or put the diversion channel in, all that's going to go into the river. How can we stop that? What can we do? And so they worked with the Alpha Design Group to determine just some ideas. And so all of these were just student-led designs based on what information was available at the moment. So that sums up the 3 capstone projects.
So in number 2, did they, I mean, we know that was also Chuck Eaton had a
That was his idea.
design. That was his idea.
Yep, they were using his focus of what if, and it was just more of a hypothetical, could this happen? Is it feasible?
And they concluded it's feasible,
Yes.
but we're not sure it satisfies the fish regulators.
It did satisfy the fish, it did.
Yeah.
They worked with, that was the group that worked with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It did meet all the requirements, and they had designed something that would work. But ODFW didn't like it because that's something they're trying to move away from, and their fear, I believe, is that if you do this diversion channel, the dam might not ever be removed because you've bypassed that issue. And they wanted the dam removed, so they didn't want the interim item. So, actually, and I realize I have one more slide. So what we'd learned, this one was, it was an opportunity for students to gain some real life experience in actual projects, something physical, not just the make-believe student world. And the city ended up getting some free ideas that, that kind of researched basically Chuck Eaton's idea of, is it feasible? And so it didn't cost the city anything to see that, yeah, it is something that isn't completely impossible. Well, I do. I have a lot. Actually, that was the same one, wasn't it? Oh, what was what we learned? There we go. Oh, and that was it. That there is a possible interim solution for the migratory fish, and there is also some steps that can be taken. The laminar group with the contaminated soils had come up with a feasible solution to how to cap the soils now to kind of enclose the contaminated soil, and it would hold it in place that when either the dam got removed or the diversion channel came in, that we wouldn't get all the sediments flowing into the Willamette River, that it would stay in place. And that was one of the focus of theirs, to keep the pollution out of the river.
Cap it how?
It's a soil cap. They had done different gravels and clay, and part of the report was how, and then you'd basically just, you could either use barges or cranes to place it, and they came up with the depths that this soil cap would be to hold the soil in.
Okay.
So if I can just jump back in for a second, I would say I think there's still some potential in here. It's at such a high level, diffuse level, that it's hard to know how much potential there is. But what I believe our next step is then go back at that regulatory table, go back to ODF&W, talk to DEQ, actually run through this, really talk about what it would take in terms of additional refinement of these concepts to make them real, to actually weigh them. I mean, right now, we're not funded to do that work. How much interest is there? We'd really need them to participate in that. So to me, that is the next step, is say, okay, we've heard that there's not a lot of interest here. Is that true? Does that mean we put these things to bed and we go back, let's chart a path to removal? Or do we need to have some more discussion here about putting some additional resources to refining this as an alternative concept, or even a preliminary, could you do a phase 1 and a phase 2? Would it make some sense to pursue this in the near term if you can get to a lower cost alternative? So I think that's where we have to go from here, is to restart that conversation and report out on these elements.
Right. Well, I think even if the diversion concept doesn't make the ODF&W happy, I think I'm interested in the capping concept, because even in 2013 dollars, that was $4+ million to remove all the soils, and that was pretty conservative, or not a conservative estimate, I would say. I suspect today it would be a whole lot more to remove all the soils and to take them wherever they take bad soils, the bad soils place. So I'd be very curious to hear if that concept was less expensive, if it's just as good environmentally.
Well, you know, the one guy from DEQ that was at our Oregon Solutions meeting, and I'm not going to remember his name, but he also said to us when we were down there that he thought there was a way to keep the cap. Yep. Yeah.
And you had also asked us, I'm sorry, if they'd done some additional testing and if I was able to get that information back to you today, which I haven't been, but I think that also needs to get folded into it too. This has now been a year, what additional work has been done, technical or otherwise, that should inform this conversation. So again, going back to that group, who is it our same DEQ contact? How do we feel about remediating the contaminated soils? Where are we? Because we really need to get to kind of a preferred solution and a cost. Otherwise, we can't pursue some of the potential opportunities.
Right, yeah. It'd be good to have something nailed down. Thank you. Neil, did you want to weigh in on processes where you're at?
Oh, you have it separate?
No, it should be on there. Just go ahead and.
You can start introducing yourself.
Yeah.
Get it queued up.
Well, thank you. I'm Neil Schulman. I came on board as the executive director of the North Clackamas Urban Watersheds Council in late July. So it's good to meet the three of you I haven't met already. My disclaimer is that I am obviously relatively new still, so I don't have the history of this project as well as some of you. So if some of what I'm telling you is either old news or goes back way further than I'm aware, feel free to just kind of run with that. And we'll get going in a moment.
Yeah, it's not, no, not what I wanted.
Make them back.
I thought I just saw it.
Yeah, it was up there. And,
yeah, it's the.
There we go.
There we go.
All righty, now I get to figure out what I had done before. You want to do it or you want me to?
Or just show me which button. I love computers. That's this one. Okay. So from the council perspective, this is the number one priority of the organization. There's very little question about that. Obviously, the public support is strong, and this is all about seeking the administrative pathway, and that's always going to be nonlinear, and it's going to be long. And in the conversations I've had with American Rivers, which does, kind of dam removal on small dams nationwide, what we're experiencing is not really that atypical at all. So we should feel good about that, I suppose. But the other thing is that we do kind of always strive to balance in the way that we think about it two things. The first one is really to maintain public support while also managing the public expectations that this thing is going to be out tomorrow. And the second one is really what we were just talking about a moment ago, which is when does the perfect become the enemy of the good? And are interim solutions that have a potential to become permanent, but also at the same time wanting to move forward and have proof of concept and proof that this is an environmental benefit. If we can get to a solution that gets us 1 foot down in the door, then we keep pushing and keep moving. A couple of types of opportunities. One of them is obviously mitigation, Willamette Harbor, fish credit, passage credits. Those are obviously constantly evolving. I was looking over, you saw me looking over my shoulder earlier to see if John Runyon had made it here yet. But I know he's been talking with, some of the for-profit restoration entities, and they still have some interest in projects in the outer ring of the mitigation restoration process. Kelly talked about the ODOT STIP. There are public grants available. None of them are going to be of the size or magnitude to kind of knock off the multi-million-dollar components of a project like this, but they could be pieces of the puzzle, or they could help pay for design, or they could help pay for studies that, if additional studies are needed. I would say the metro area bond measure that is being shaped as we speak is, and I've been in a lot of those meetings, as I'm sure some of you have, on the jurisdictional side as well. That's being shaped while we're speaking now. And I think one of those things that I think we can help advocate for at the metro table is the importance of large projects like this, and the fact that, again, because of the amount of infrastructure available, that it needs to be prioritized. The Metro 2020 bond measure for transportation, I think, has not really started yet, as far as I can tell, in terms of what's it going to be and how big is it going to be. But that is obviously coming down the pike, and I expect that conversation will probably start in roughly March, would be my guess. And then there's other state and federal funding opportunities that we would have to pursue. Obviously, this is a big project. This is, when we talk about things like private foundations, like Bullitt Foundation or Meyer Memorial Trust, they're going to come in, if they come into this, in like the $150,000 range in all likelihood. So we are really looking at a size that is keeping us focused on public dollars at this point. Our approach is really kind of fourfold, really, at this point. The first one is really trying to convene the partners and have a cohesive strategy. And as Kelly said, just kind of getting to alternatives, preferred alternative, keeping it on the various radar screens. This is going to be multi-pronged, and it's going to be iterative, and it's kind of, I would say it's going to be the thing that moves really slow until it moves fast, until there is if there is somebody that kicks the tires on it enough and says, yes, as a mitigation trading opportunity, this could pencil out, then it could move quite quickly. And really trying to consolidate, looking for the way to consolidate all those moving parts and bring those conversations into the place where everybody, the left hand and the right hand, are talking. And I think that regional solutions team is the likely forum for that. And then the fourth is really trying to participate in that shaping of the Metro bond measure. We have, I would say, a pretty sizable set of existing allies that all want this thing to move forward, and you are obviously at the top of that. I would say a lot of them are also not sure nobody is really sure what that pathway is, but they're generally supportive. And I think if we can create a clarity about, okay, this is what your role is, I think that will help. There's also some potential allies. Obviously, we'll have a new Metro councilor for District 2 and a new Metro president starting in January. And there are groups that are, I think, they're not fully mobilized. And where it fits on their priorities, we will, I think the prioritization is the issue, not whether or not they want to see it done. A couple of cautions. Again, the cost of this is so large or potentially so large if we go for full removal, that it's going to be focused on federal and state funding or private restoration mitigation credit trading. Again, the intermediate steps versus the removal message, and not wanting to think that, oh yeah, we found a way to make some improvements to the fish ladder, did a temporary side channel, and that suddenly becomes permanent. Obviously, the lack of coordination among partners is true. There's also always the potential for agency shifts over a project of this lifespan. Again, we have, new elected officials at the Metro table, and the effect of that, if there is one, is not clear. So that's just always kind of a process. We have 2 funding requests that we are in the pipeline that are, again, relatively small in terms of basically would pay for a chunk of my time to keep pushing this forward, as opposed to working on other projects on the Watershed Council table. One of them is to Patagonia, and the other one is to Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And the Patagonia we expect to hear from sometime at the end of January. OWEB will rule on their grant in April, and that obviously the city wrote a letter of support for, so you're aware of. But that is really to kind of consolidate this process and continue to move it forward. I don't know the likelihood of either of these. OWEB, I would say, is always a little bit dicey in projects in what they consider to be the urban area. And that is, but, you know, we can keep pushing it forward as well, regardless. And I figure you've seen enough words on the screen, so I figured I'd throw you a cool picture of fish that you probably have seen many times before.
I recognize that picture.
Yeah.
Is that your picture? Oh, is it? But there was some word you had on the screen like two slides back that I wanted to. Okay. One question I had was, you had the fishing groups, and so the fishing groups are apparently meeting tonight.
Yes, they are. I touched base with them this morning.
And I don't know what they have, some newfound. They're trying to forge some coalition about the Lower Willamette?
Yeah, it's about the Lower Willamette. My understanding of it from my conversation with them today, which was a little cut short just because they were organizing this event, is that it is mostly, their target is mostly the Corps, and it seems to be a little release focused in terms of dam operations on the Willamette to be more fish friendly. That being said, I think there's still plenty of opportunities to work with them. They also are working obviously with the same elected officials that we are in terms of the congressional delegation, and there's a huge amount of coinciding. I obviously can't be there tonight because I'm here, and then I have yet another meeting. But I told them that we want to be connected with what they're doing, and that the likelihood that we can each scratch each other's back is high. And Mark, I know you talked with them as well. And they kind of have yet the first round of this coalition is really the fly fishing organizations, the Northwest Steelheaders and Native Fish Society, and Trout Unlimited, and those types of organizations, which are great. And their next round of outreach that they had planned on doing was to the various watershed councils. So, or at least that's what they said once I called them. But I think they're good folks. They're good folks. I've worked with most of those organizations in the past.
I toured the Superfund site today with a couple of state legislators, and it was on a completely unrelated bent, but I was led to believe that that process seems to be moving now, that it's becoming unstuck a little bit. So has anybody had the opportunity to sort of check in with the various players up there to find out where they are on mitigation potential?
Well, what I had heard, which is, I would say, a month old at this point, well, in regards to the meeting that was in the Portland Tribune today, that may be an attempt to jumpstart the process, and it's unclear, really there's a lot of posturing around that very large meeting that makes me not believe anything anyone says about.
I don't know if all of council knows that, but there was a meeting today of the Portland Harbor Superfund, like the PRPs and their legal teams and stuff that the EPA was convening.
Yeah, and it was even unclear who was, whether the EPA was convening it or if the PRPs had asked for it. And again, that's where I think the political posturing came into play. What I had heard from the NOAA Restoration Center when I met with them, I would say a month or so ago, was really they had put a little bit of a hiatus on the number of projects that they're actively supporting in terms of mitigation projects, basically because A, their staff time is limited, but B, what they didn't want to do was have so many projects come online that it drove down the potential market value of the restoration credits. If too many of those were issued at the same time, basically, the value of them all would become less, and that would be a disincentive for potential, for basically the outfits that do these projects on spec to either take on new projects because you can't sell the credits for as much, or potentially even to walk away from a project that was underway because they suddenly no longer pencils out. So I've heard nothing to say that has been lifted, but that doesn't mean folks can't take on projects. It just means that NOAA is not helping nurture them along until they feel more comfortable with that ecosystem credit market. And there are other forms of ecosystem credits as well that I am not that familiar with that could come into play at some point. A long answer to a short question.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions at this point? Well, I think, your concept around trying to coordinate the various agencies and get a bigger portion of the, like the culvert removal projects aimed at this project, I think is probably the ripest concept we have, and I think that we definitely need to be pursuing that. And then obviously more, because that's not going to completely do it. But I think that feels like our highest potential. I think, the Metro Natural Areas Bond, I wouldn't hold my breath on that being a real high potential for this. I mean, there might be a few $100,000 for study or research or planning or something, but I don't see them throwing down $4 million towards removal of a dam. And I would also say that the transportation bond is also, I'm sitting at the tables that conversation has been happening for the last year. There's a lot of, it's looking like it's likely to be very big, but also very targeted. So it would surprise me if we got $16 million to remove a dam and replace a bridge that ODOT will tell you is a perfectly good bridge.
Yeah, it would be. I agree that the direction it's headed in right now, I'm not like, slam dunk. But I also do feel like it's worth talking through and considering about a little bit, because it is a state highway, and it is actually a really congested state highway. So, and there are I don't know, and so that's where I think just some discussion around what transit elements could potentially be enhanced or improved if you did a modification there. I don't know yet, but I think
exactly. The Q jump lane for the bus would have to have a wider road right there, right?
Yeah, it definitely would. But we don't have a plan for that right now. So all of this is, some folks are going to have to start spending some money to design things. And right now we don't actually have those funds budgeted for us. So going back to, I think I've really enjoyed getting to know Neil and talking this through with him over the past month and a half, because the regional solutions table, and hopefully I think if he could get the OWEB funds and convene that bigger group, could be really complementary efforts, because you've got the interagencies, which are covering a lot of what we need to cover with the fish and DEQ, and even Superfund gets touched on in that forum as well, with a larger group of stakeholders that I think you really need, that brings in potential private investment and other really important stakeholders. So I think there's a way that those two things could work together really well if they both got going. And then I agree, I don't want to oversell the regional options at all. But I also want to keep thinking through how, particularly on the transportation side, some element of it might be a fit.
It could be, yeah. It's not outside of the realm of possibility.
And I would say even if we are unsuccessful with this particular OWEB grant or subsequent applications that we'll probably put into other sources to fund that process, I think just reconvening that regional solutions team out of dormant mode will be great, because I think it will help us use the opportunities that do present themselves better. And, the kind of fish ladder conversation is kind of the prime example of that, where, just prevent those surprises and make sure that when we do have those opportunities, we know what we want as opportunities become available.
I'm sorry we've run over and,
That's okay.
yeah, thank you for your time.
It's important to us. If anybody else doesn't have any, okay, thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much.
So the regular session is scheduled to start at 6. We may be a few minutes late because we haven't had any dinner yet, so we will go do that quickly and be back.